next week, we're going to do a massive Q&A session, assuming you guys come with questions. Today, we're going to hit Dialog, which is that first weird acronym up there. And then we're going to go into our publishing discussion, where I'll talk about agents and, if we have time, kind of do a rundown of some of the science fiction fantasy publishers that are out there. So, let's talk about Dialog. Dialog. This little acronym of mine is a work in progress. I've been trying to find a way to kind of talk about what I think makes good dialogue, because it's a hard one. As if with a lot of things in writing, it really depends on what you're trying to do. But these are things to keep in mind, and I'm going to go down these one at a time. The first one is motivation. M is motive. So I would say the number one cause of stilted dialogue when I read it in newer writers' writing is because they are throwing character motive out the window and are letting the plot necessities drive the story through the dialogue instead. For instance, they have heard, well, you want to show versus tell when it comes to your world building. And I've also heard that a Watson character, a character who can have things explained to them, is a great sort of character. And so I'll put my world building in dialogue, which is not a bad way to go, honestly. But then they dump it into a big, long explanation of world building that's just as boring as if you had put it into narrative. It doesn't really achieve what you want to do because it bores everyone silly. And more importantly, oftentimes there's no reason in that moment for the character to be asking for this information. Or if there is reason, like, what the heck is going on? You know, monsters are falling from the sky and they're eating everything. The person that would explain to them would probably say, we don't have time to explain this. Monsters are trying to eat us. But in a lot of stories, they'll be like, let me tell you what's going on. Well, the monsters are from Venus, and blah, 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 blah. And the motive gets lost in the plot necessity. Good dialogue, in my opinion, is dialogue where the writer understands why each character is coming to this dialogue, what they're bringing to it, and keeps attention on what the character wants in life, why they're talking the way that they're talking. The I is individuality. And I kind of rank these in descending importance. So individuality is good dialogue, I feel, is dialogue often where you can tell the different characters apart, even without the dialogue tags, because of the way that they speak. Now, let's dig into accents and dialect. Who here likes a thick dialect in writing? There are none of you. Usually there's one or two. Usually there's a couple. Yeah?
It's sprinkled in.
Yeah.
I don't like it being...
Okay, that's not, yeah. Dialect is a divisive thing, and you have to understand that if you write in strong dialect, a large number of readers will just skim over it. Or if the whole book is in that, it'll be troubling for them. That is one way to make characters distinctive, is dialect. The other problem with dialect is if you're trying to write an Earth dialect and you do a poor job, which it's very easy to do a poor job if you aren't from the culture representing that dialect, it's going to become a gross stereotype. So, two big problems with dialect. The way that you kind of handle this, one way is to sprinkle it in, to back off on it a little bit and use a word here and there to indicate this person is speaking in a dialect. Someone who does this is Gambit from the X-Men comics. Gambit, depending on who's writing Gambit, sometimes has a very thick dialect. Sometimes it's just sprinkled through, and you're like, oh yeah, he's speaking with a Cajun accent because of this occasional word here and there. They're not putting an apostrophe every time he shortens a word. Some writers do, but a lot of writers don't. So you can approach this in many different ways. I'm more on the kind of sprinkle it in. Less is more, hint at the dialect instead of go full bore into it. But different people have different opinions on this. For instance, Terry Pratchett, who is a master of almost all forms writing, he will use a thick dialect sometimes in his books, and the way he gets around it is he has a character in the next sentence usually repeat what they said or ask a question that implies what they said, in the same way that if you can't understand Chewbacca or R2-D2, then the character's context will let you understand what they're saying. Is there anyone who understands Chewbacca or R2-D2? Someone nodded their head. And here I thought it was just random noises. But that's what Terry Pratchett does in The We Free Men, is he gets around it like this. So one method is dialect. What are other methods you can think of to make a character individual in the way they talk?
Well, I guess if they're super intelligent, they could be using longer, bigger words.
Right, super intelligent, using longer, bigger words. This one comes up a lot. Do people actually do this? Sometimes. Not as often as you would think. They will lapse into it if they're speaking about their field of interest. Otherwise, people who are more educated don't tend to actually use longer words that much in normal conversation. But yes, it is something you do. I'm warning you about this because a lot of writers get really heavy-handed with this, and it comes off as, again, a stereotype. Sprinkling it in works. Let me ask you this. Someone's intelligent. What are different ways that you can indicate that you have let's not say intelligent, say highly educated character that is not just lots. You guys have read the things, big word, big word, big word. Oh, this person's smart.
I think whether or not they use contractions a lot.
Using contractions a lot, that one goes overboard with a lot of people too. I'm gonna say yes, watch for that, but listen to educated people. I mean, one of these is realism. The R is realism, and we don't always want to be super realistic, and so the no contractions thing does help. It also makes someone feel more alien. You'll see that people who are supposed to feel alien in books often will use fewer contractions. But I would say I'd warn against this one because it's been used so much. I think you can get it across in other ways as well. What do you got over here?
If you have like an analytical person, they could talk in passive voice. So instead,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, analytical, highly educated people do tend to dissemble more. They say, wait, that point you just made, I'm going to argue that point. They've been trained, a lot of educated people have been trained in more formal argumentative methods. Most of you in this room probably have been, if simply through taking English classes and then saying, this is how you make an argument here, or trained in logic and things like that. The passive voice is very common, particularly in philosophy, philosophical writing, and so people who lapse into that in kind of lecture mode, that is something we do when we're more educated, lecture mode, right? Well, let me tell you about this thing you don't know about.
Have other characters refer to them in that way.
Yeah, have other characters refer to them that way. That's good. What else we got?
I know in my field a lot of people use a lot of logical reasoning.
Yeah.
Conversation, that's how you approach the world, and that other different levels of education will use like more emotional reasons to approach the world.
Yeah, that's definitely a way you could go.
I think a lot of times smart people don't need to try to be smart, and they're just right. And then you know they're smart because they're right all the time.
Okay. So let's. You guys are thinking about this one. This is good. That's not this. There's plenty of ways to do this, but what I want you to do is be thinking about this. Now, this one in particular is kind of dangerous because it's easy to make a character who's condescending. But a lot of highly educated people are condescending, so that might be what you want to do. I'll reference another one. I happen to know some very intelligent people. And one thing I've noticed about them is when they get together with other intelligent people, their conversation changes a lot. They start skipping logical steps that the rest of us have to make. And my experience is that they make lots of inside jokes very quickly and reference lots of pop culture. The people who are highly educated and considered nerdy smart in our society. Earl and I have some mutual friends who are very like this. And so I would go to that direction, right? Maybe if I were trying in our culture to write someone that I'm indicating, hey, this is a person who considers themselves very intelligent and who is highly educated. But individuality, there's lots of different ways you can go about this. People normally jump to the word choice or the dialect, which, yes, these are ways to do it. A lot of people are more aggressive in their conversation, while other people are more circumspect. That's another way to differentiate people. And their culture is how aggressive are they in just stating bluntly what they want or dancing around it. How passive are they in their conversations? How excited do they get about topics and what they're talking about? Varying sentence size and length is another great way to differentiate somebody.
So rhythm and pattern.
Rhythm and pattern, yes. And I think these are going to be stronger methods than, now you sometimes want to use a shorthand. Sometimes a shorthand is really helpful. And the shorthand are the things like, here's a linguistic marker of which culture this person comes from, or a linguistic marker for this character. My experience has been that if you overuse these, they get grating on people. I've tried out a bunch of different types of these things, but they do work as a shorthand very well. It tends to work better if you can get some of these rhythms for the main characters. Someone is always worried about the implications of what someone else brings up, while another person never really thinks through the ramifications of what they say. These sorts of things will help you make your characters individual in ways that don't feel cheap, right? And again, I'm not bagging on the long words or the contractions, but I think we've all read a lot of characters where here's the smart person, watch the number of $6 words they use in every sentence. And that just kind of feels now like a cliche to me. Yeah, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, so one thing I've noticed in conversations with other people is that people tend to have individuals tend to have certain sentence structures that they towards.
Right. We have tells. We have linguistic tells. Does that make any sense is one of mine, right? We all have linguistic tells and things that we like to use a lot. And you will see also certain people repeat the same thing over and over again in different ways. Most of us do this, but various of us do this in different styles of repetitiveness. So, individuality, that's our I. I consider these two the most important to keep in mind. Though, the next one is conflict. A good dialogue section has its own innate conflict in it. This doesn't mean necessarily that the people are arguing. It can mean that they're arguing. That's one method of conflict. But there should be tension to basically everything you put in a book. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have one person who's aggressive in their conversation and another person who's passive, that can automatically create some conflict, particularly if you're in the viewpoint of the person who's a little more circumspect in the way that they like to say things. People go into conversations in books hopefully wanting something. They have a motive. Maybe it's just to make sure that everyone is happy. Maybe it's to get someone to reveal some information. They go in wanting something in your conversations, and you need to kind of build that tension. A conversation between people, even two people who agree and are kind of trying to figure out, exactly what they think about something, will have a certain tension to it. And this makes for good dialogue. Tension makes for good everything. Conflict makes for good everything. Like I've said, that's the glue. But remember this. Let's say you're doing your conversation. You've got your Watson character, who is the cabbage head, as Howard likes to say, who doesn't know about a certain topic. And you have your other character who does know about the topic. And the Watson character is trying to get information about world building. How can you insert tension and conflict into that conversation so that it's not boring and feels like an info dump? Go.
What if the other person's busy doing something?
Yeah, the other person's busy. They don't want to explain. Right.
Watson characters questioning the motives or the friendliness of the other characters, so they're trying to ask things by asking them.
Yeah, not trying to get it out without quite talking to them about it because they aren't sure that they can trust. Either one may not be sure if they can trust the other person. Maybe this person thinks the cabbage head's a spy and just trying to find out what they know or things like this.
I think make it important to the character, not just the reader.
Yeah, very, very good element. That goes back to motive, right? Yeah.
I think also when you, in a Sherlock walks in kind of
Yep.
scenario, Sherlock just kind of is like, well, it's like this. It's like, I don't know how you got there. You need to backtrack and
Yeah, back up a few steps here. And, Sherlock's like, I don't want to back up a few steps. I'm on to like step number 12. And Watson's like, explain number 4 to me again.
Yeah.
There's tension in those conversations. And it works best. Like, I love the new adaptation of Sherlock, the BBC one, because you understand that both characters, like, Sherlock is messed up and needs Watson's humanity, and Watson needs Sherlock's genius. They both come to the conversation needing something, and so there's an innate tension in their conversations where they're kind of trying to pull these things out of each other. In Sherlock's case, not even really realizing that that's what he needs and why he wants Watson there. So, conflict, motive, individuality. Let's go to realism. This one comes with a big old asterisk on it, meaning you will want to decide how realistic you want your dialogue to be and shoot for that. Okay? When I'm talking about realism dialogue, I like to bring up Joss Whedon. How realistic is Joss Whedon's dialogue? Horribly unrealistic. Horribly unrealistic, and he's one of my favorite dialogue writers in film. Okay? People are too glib, too fast off the cuff, and often too funny, even within their individuality, to be real, and I love it. Okay? Absolutely love it. A lot of humor. Terry Pratchett's dialogue is like this too, although in a different way. People dig into their characters so far in a Pratchett story that they become caricatures, and it's hilarious. Realism, some people like to write dialogue just like people say it. This can be really grating. This is an instance where the reality is in many ways less real feeling to us than the falsehood. What I'm saying here is there's this tradition in dialogue throughout film, stage, and books where we pretend we all are slightly more eloquent than we are. And we write it in such a way that when we read it, we have a perception of realism without adding every interruption and things we stick into dialogue. It's slimmer, it's trimmer, it's more focused. It can still feel real to us, but it is a fabrication. You can go either direction from this. Joss goes a direction toward unrealistic, from this kind of happy median of the normal implication of realism without being real. Other writers say, no, I want to take steps back, and I want to really have people talk like they talk, as close as I can get. And you've probably read literature where people do that. A lot of the dialects come from people trying to do this. And there's no right answer to this. It's your choice. People in Shakespeare do not talk like people talk. In fact, you can read essays from the time where people are like, I can't understand what these people are saying in these Shakespeare plays. It doesn't make any sense. We just pretend everyone talked like that back then. Guess what? They didn't. Shakespeare was really good at dialogue. He was, Joss Whedon is Shakespearean in his approach to his dialogue. It's very unrealistic, but very, very entertaining. That's why we have an asterisk here. It's not try to be real, it's decide your level of realism and go for it. Now, I will say that I said the main cause of stilted dialogue was motive. I'd say the secondary cause is realism. When people read dialogue and they're like, wow, this just feels stilted, it's because it doesn't feel real. And there can be a lot of meanings behind it doesn't feel real. It can not feel real because you aren't doing the motives, the individuality part. It can also just not feel real because someone's getting up and giving a huge lecture, which we do, as proven by me doing this to you. But it feels too much like a well-crafted St. Crispin's Day speech, as opposed to someone muddling through an argument. Making it a little more real can help with that, looking at dialogue. Studying the great writers of dialogue. A lot of screenwriters are much better at this than a lot of writers of novels. Reading some screenplays, saying, okay, what are they doing? What do I like about this? I also recommend doing the exercise if you've never done before. Go eavesdrop on some conversations in the Cougar Eat and write them down verbatim and see how people actually talk. and say, okay, I probably don't want to write exactly like this, but how can I give this impression, this feeling with my writing, right? A lot of writing is about being able to paint the picture with a few lines instead of painting the exact 100% how it is. You had a comment or question earlier.
You seem to suggest that if it's too realistic, that's a problem. How do you tell if you're too realistic?
Most of these things, how do you tell if it's too realistic? Again, too realistic is only a problem if it is not fulfilling your goals as a writer, okay? But let's say you give your book to a sample audience, and the sample audience is just like, oh, this dialogue just doesn't flow. This dialogue feels like it's choppy and boring, and I can't really follow it. That might mean that you're being too real. Too many breaks in conversation, too many ums, too many circular conversations, stuff like that. Test audiences are really going to help you with a lot of these things. Any questions on realism? All right, last one is objective. And this, instead of the character motives, is your objective for the scene. I put this last on the list because these other things should be more important for making your dialogue work, but you do want the scene to achieve things. What you want it to achieve depends on what your outline is. We want to get this, figure out this clue. We found this clue, 3 different people think it means 3 different things. They're going to argue about it and come to a conclusion. We therefore are progressing the plot. Or these 2 characters need to have a romantic liaison where they are flirting with one another. And I want the flirtatious things to feel flirtatious so that these characters are having a relationship that gets better and better. That's your objective in writing this dialogue. Or, in the example we've been using, we need to explain why giant dragons are coming from Venus and, eating our cars. Let's make sure we explain that after we make sure that we're keeping the other 4 things in mind. If you don't actually achieve your objective, it's still a failed piece of writing, no matter how charming it might be. So don't throw this one out the window, but do realize I feel that it is the least of the 5. And a lot of times, again, when we have the stilted dialogue, people are writing it as the first of the 5.
How closely related do you feel like good dialogue is to a well-crafted scene?
I think it depends on how much dialogue there is in the scene.
Yeah, say it's like a normal, like people are talking, right? Like
Then I think
break a scene with that.
dialogue definitely makes or breaks this thing. People who can write great dialogue and have poor narrative usually do better than the vice versa as writers. That's my experience. Yeah.
This might seem like an odd question, but if you have like a quiet scene in your book, there's not really, the point is more like just developing your character's personality.
Yeah, the navel gazing scenes.
Yeah, exactly. So how would you do, the 2 things I'm questioning are like conflict and the objective. Because if the objective is just to establish them.
This is specifically for dialogue. If it's a scene without dialogue, then this is not what we're applying to it. This is a scene where there are 2 people having a conversation to help you make your dialogue more authentic and feel better to the reader. If what you're doing is, for instance, your scene, if I wanted to inject dialogue into it, person is sitting and considering their options. They're like at the Zen garden or something. And they sit down to think about, their life. And someone starts playing rock music next door and interrupts it, and they, go over to say, can you quiet this down? You now have their tension being interrupted. Or their friend just comes and bugs them, right? I am going to be at one with the universe. And the friend is like, have you played the new Clash of Clans update? It's great. And they're like, I am trying to be at one with the universe. Clash of Clans is awesome, blah, 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 blah. This person doesn't get it, right? This is my 6-year-old, okay? Right? Has not learned to pick up on social cues yet when someone is not really interested in what you're telling them. So this could be a way that you put dialogue into that scene if you wanted to, and then you show the person kind of fleeing this or escaping it some way. You've achieved your tension and your characterization, and then you give them a short time to kind of do their reflection. That might make for a stronger scene overall, because instead of telling us they wanted to be alone with their thoughts, so they went to the river, you have them sitting at the river and someone interrupt them.
Yeah, it's show don't tell.
Yeah, show, don't tell. Yes?
Do you have any tips for writing dialogue for characters that are radically different than you, like coming from a different background or with a disability or something?
Yeah. Go read what people like that have written. Go to forums. Go listen to them. Listen to interviews. Take notes. And if you're very worried about it, the best thing you can do is find somebody from that group who can alpha read for you after you've done it. Mary, famously in her latest book, which is really good, went and she was on Antigua. It was set on Antigua where people are speaking in a thick accent, a thick dialect. And she wrote it all out and then paid a writer from that culture to go rewrite all the dialogue by the characters who are speaking in that dialect to make it work. She actually paid her and found an actual writer. And it turned out great. So that's an extreme example, but it works really well. All right. Today is kind of a fire hose day because I want to catch up on some things. So we're going to go off of dialogue. If there are no other questions, we're going to go talk about agents. Okay. All right. So agents. The first thing that I usually have to fight against with people in their preconceptions of dealing with agents is that the depictions of agents in films and television show are usually depicting Hollywood agents. Agents for us are book agents, and the majority of them are in New York. And anyone who's been to New York and been to LA knows that the cultures are very different in these two places. And the cultures of agenting are very different. And so you kind of need to abandon your Hollywood view of the agent and look at a book agent, which tend to be either New Yorkers or people who've lived in New York for a long time. They tend to be a lot more terse and a lot more upfront with you, which I like. They can also be kind of blunt, okay? I want to prepare you for that, as many of you are Westerners. New Yorkers can be kind of blunt. My editor, the second time I met him, after he bought my book, it was about a year later, he said, "Wow, you got fat. Have you always been this fat? Did I miss it?" That's just a New Yorker. That's just how they are, right? He's like, "Eat more salads. I need you to live a long time because you're paying my mortgage." He actually said that to me. So that's not my agent. He's a little bit more delicate than that, but this is how New Yorkers can be. I like this about the agenting community because you may have in your mind this impression of agents as being kind of slimy. I have not yet met any book agents who give that feeling to me. I have met Hollywood agents that give that feeling to me. New York agents, so let's back up and talk about what an agent is. So, an agent's job is kind of threefold, okay? First off, their job is to sell your book. Okay? Secondly, their job is to negotiate. And three is advice. Okay? Now, there are many different parts to these three roles. But the one that you generally are most interested in, particularly as a new writer, is to sell your book. What a lot of agents do is they spend a lot of time going to lunch with editors, talking to the editors, finding out what it is that the editors want, what they're buying right now, what they're excited about, and they then try to find books that match what specific editors are interested in and match those books to those editors. And in exchange, they take 15%. All right, 15% of everything that they negotiate. It used to be 10%, it moved up to 15% right after I broke in, right about the time I broke. When I broke in, Joshua, my agent, had been taking 10%, and all his new contracts said 15. I think I was one of his first new clients that was at 15. So they do this. As a subset of this, they also sell it overseas and handle subsidiary, which means things like movie deals, selling to the audiobook, or things like this, right? Yes.
Is the 15% the chunk of what you're getting for your 15% on your like on
Yeah.
hardcover or whatever?
Yeah.
So it's like a
Yeah, it's whatever that. So what generally happens is the money from the publisher comes to the agent. The agent takes 15% out and sends the rest to you. Okay? This is a point of some contention to a small subset of writers who do not want the money going to the agent first. And in that case, you can negotiate a deal with the agent and the publisher that the publisher just sends 15% directly to the agent. The advantage to you of having it happen this way is that what will happen is, let's take me for example. I have agreements with 4 different publishers. Emperor's Souls with a small press. The old Alcatraz books were with Scholastic, and there's still some weird things happening there. We have Tor and we have Random House. All the money from those various people come into Joshua, as well as all the money from 25 foreign countries. He then sends me 1 check, and at the end of the year, 1 1099 form for taxes, which makes taxes way easier, even though my taxes are crazy still. For your average writer, what this means is if you have like 5 or 6 sources of income, you only have to deal with 1 form. But the flip side of this, and why some people don't like it, is if you're worried about your agent being upfront with you, which hopefully you won't ever be worried about, but there are some people who are like, you know what, you should never put someone in the control of handling your money and then sending on some to you. That's their argument. So just be aware of that argument. Certain people talk about this online, and you can get a deal where it's done a different way. Okay? So they sell your book. Ideally, what's going to happen is you submit to an agent. They really like your submission. They pick it up. Then they go to all of their contacts in New York, and they say, hey, I've got this great book. Would you be interested in reading it? And they give it to like 12 of them. That's what you would hope, right? 12 or whatever the best publishers. These publishers read it, come back to the agent and say, yeah, I like this. And then a certain number of them are interested, and then the agent handles negotiating, an auction if it goes there, and kind of counsels you about which of these deals they think is best, though you make the final call on which deal you like and which publisher you like. So this is ideally what's going to happen. We'll talk about the unideal later, okay? The unideal? I don't know if that's a word. But negotiate. Once you have chosen a publisher and a deal, then the agent gets to negotiate the terms for you. Yes?
I've heard a couple different things about negotiating. I've heard some people tell me that, or some authors say that they'll bring in a literary contract lawyer.
An entertainment attorney.
Off of the agent.
I have never had an entertainment lawyer except for film deals, which get a little bit out. They're big film deals. They can get outside the agent's wheelhouse a bit, and then they can recommend this. In my case, Joshua said, I recommend this, but I don't, I'm just saying this is what the advantage is. But I've never had that happen for an actual New York deal. The agents are usually pretty good at this. Now, some people choose an IP attorney instead of an agent, which means the IP attorney does not do this or this, handles only this, and you pay them a lump sum instead of a percentage. So if you like the idea of, I think I can sell my book and I don't need the professional advice, I want to do this on my own, but I would like someone to handle negotiations, you can go to an IP attorney and pay them whatever their hourly rate is to handle the negotiations for you.
Does anyone, like, any of the big names in the industry, do they actually do that, or is that?
I don't think any of the big names do that, with the caveat that there are a few big names that are their own agent. Lee Modison is his own agent, for instance. And Lee has a history in economics and contracts and in politics, and he knows his contracts really well, and so he can negotiate them himself. He still uses an agent for foreign deals because it's generally not worth your time to fly to New York and to Hamburg and to Warsaw and maybe to Taiwan, to the big book fairs, and meet all the small publishers from the various different regions. And, a deal for a lot of these places is $500 or $1,000. which if you're flying to London Book Fair to make one of these deals, you've already lost money. But if your agent flies there and can negotiate deals for like 50 of their clients, then it's a cost-saving measure. Plus, what happens is a lot of these agents have agreements with agencies in other countries, and basically all the authors that the agent, like all the authors Joshua picks up, there's a certain agent in the UK that Joshua works with, and they just kind of consider if Joshua picks them up, they now are part of the agent in the UK's stable as well, and they try to sell them, and they make their money selling mostly people from America into the UK. And this happens all around the world, and so you have all these little agencies that are satellite agencies for some of the bigger agents and try to sell all their projects. Yes?
Does the agent cut with a foreign agent in an agreement like that?
Yeah, what happens is then it goes to, what usually happens is it's 20%, where 10 goes to each agent instead of your 15. So they take a slightly higher cut. That happens in a lot of Hollywood cases too. Like in Hollywood, my Hollywood agent gets 10% and Joshua gets 10%. But these are generally deals that you couldn't do yourself. So even though it sounds like a higher percentage, and it kind of is, it's very hard to do any of that stuff yourself. And so let me give a little aside about the foreign deals. As a newly published author, these were where I survived, which was surprising to me. Joshua was very good at foreign deals. American entertainment is well regarded around the world. Just like Japanese cars are well regarded, our entertainment is one of our major exports. This isn't to say there aren't great writers from other countries. There are plenty. But it is an advantage you have being an American or someone from the UK. Books in English, I'll let you Canadians in on that as well. Any Canadians? Yeah, there's some Canadians, aren't there? Yeah, there's usually a couple. There's some great science fiction writers from Canada. But if you're writing in the English language, there's this perception that English language entertainment it's just associated with Hollywood and all of this stuff. And so it's much easier to sell books from America to other countries than it is for people who want to break into America if it's originally in another language. And this money was what I lived on. My first deal with Tor was for was $10,000 for a book, right? Which is pretty good. It's a little higher than the average. Joshua, they offered me 5. Joshua argued it up to 10, and then they paid me that $5,000 on signing and $5,000 on like publication. So the first year I was published, I got like $5,000 to live on, right? It actually is $10,000 because it was a 2-book deal. So I had $10,000 my first year, and then the second year was $5,000 because I turned in the first of the books, and the third year I turned in the second of the books. So my income from Tor was $10,000, $5,000, $5,000 for the first 3 years of my career. But Joshua took it and sold it in a multitude of other countries, and so when your total income for the year is $5,000 from the U.S. publisher, and he gets 3 deals for $1,000 each, that's a pretty big deal early on. And when he got my first film deal, which happened that third year, when I made $5,000 here, and then the film deal was like $35,000, that was a big deal, right? That was really, really good money, and that's kind of how I survived on those early years, was from the subsidiary rights, because I wasn't making royalties from my books because they hadn't been out long enough yet, okay? So the foreign deals, don't discount them. And even these days, while the bulk of my money is from the US, the UK makes a very sizable sum for me, as does Taiwan, Germany, France, and Spain. Those tend to be the biggest. South American Spanish is becoming bigger and bigger. Portuguese is becoming bigger and bigger. Usually you sell books in places that have, let's put this delicately, an economy where people are interested in looking toward the future and science fiction and fantasy type things. So a lot of third world countries, people aren't interested in fantasy for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. But yeah, so for a long time, you weren't selling in a lot of these countries. They're starting to. For instance, China is starting to pick up, but Taiwan is way bigger Taiwan and Japan, despite smaller populations than China, for sales of fantasy and science fiction books. Yeah.
If you get a deal in one of these other countries, does your agent take care of like the translation and all those?
So what happens with a deal is the publisher buys the rights to translate it into another language. So the agent doesn't handle it, the publisher does. The agent handles negotiating your terms and things like this, and then they handle it from there. Okay? Yep. Okay, so negotiate. They talk contracts. So what are some of the things they should be arguing for? Let's go to the side over here and say, one is your advance. This is one of the big deals for having an agent and a New York deal instead of self-publishing is they can pay a lot of money up front. They probably won't. But once in a while they will. And it's pretty easy for an agent to argue an initial offer up to about double what they offer. Going higher than double usually requires multiple publishers to be interested, which means they can also do an auction. Anytime you hear of a really big advance from a first-time writer in New York, it is because there has been an auction. This means that multiple publishers want the book, and they are all bidding higher and higher, and sometimes bidding too much to get that book. It's basically the only way you get advances that are huge for new writers. Very hard to do on your own because most publishers will not work with a writer directly on an auction. That's just part of the industry. They don't want you submitting the books to multiple people. The agent, they let do that. The author, they don't want to do it. If you can still get away with it, you can still do it, but they're not probably going to let you auction it yourself. And you probably wouldn't want to because you would not get as good a deal. The agent should make you money. If they're doing their job, you will get more money despite paying them 15%. The other thing that they can do is they will argue your royalties. As we spoke last time, royalties are kind of set. There's much less wiggle room here than there are in advances. For instance, like Joshua has gotten like my paperback royalties from like 6% to 8%, I think. Or maybe, it's something like that. The hardback royalty has never changed, but some of the breakpoints on the royalties have changed. Like it's like, instead of on the first 75,000, Brandon getting this percentage, it's this lower percentage on the first 50,000, and then after that, it goes to the higher percentage, right? Royalties there's a lot less wiggle room in. Where there is a lot of wiggle room are the subsidiary rights. Almost every contract I've ever seen from a publisher offering it has tried to take all the rights possible, including all future rights in any format that it might exist. They actually do this. And most agents say, well, you can't have foreign rights. You can only have what we call, North American English or World English. The English is split into two. North American, which includes the Philippines. Yes. Which is what you would expect it to be, except plus the Philippines. And then World English is the right to publish it in English and distribute in English in every other country in the world, which mostly means the UK and Australia, and I guess we'll let the Kiwis be part of that too. But does also mean that there's some decent bookstores in like Amsterdam and Paris that sell in English language, and there's bunches in Scandinavia. A lot of the Scandinavians like to read in English. And then India, which is kind of a growing market for English language books, that would all be handled by the UK publisher. Usually you sell them World English, sell North American to the publisher in America. Now, every publisher I've known wants to buy the World English at the very least. The reason you don't want them to have it is they're usually pretty bad at exploiting it. Not always, but usually, if all things being equal, you could sell it all to your publisher, and they would distribute it around the world in all these different languages and be so much easier on you. You don't have to handle all these different contracts, and it all comes to the publisher. The problem is most of this is too small potatoes, or they're too disorganized. Or they're buying it because, for instance, one time at Tor, Tor UK there had been a mandate for Tor US to try and buy the rights to the big author's English language so that Tor UK could have them if they wanted to. But then Tor UK usually didn't want them because they wanted to buy their own stuff. So they get these rights sold to Tor US. They say, here you go, Tor UK. And Tor UK is like, oh, great, thanks. We might get around to that someday, and then never exploit it.
Does this vary depending on the publisher? Like if it's a larger publishing house, do they?
Yeah, the larger the publisher, the more rights grabs they'll try to get. But the secret to this is every agent I know will strike out almost every one of those, and the publisher won't argue that much because they know that in every contract with every major agent, the stuff all gets struck out anyway. Right? Now, once in a while, there'll be sticking points. For instance, Scholastic really wanted North American Spanish rights because they do Spanish language with their book fairs, and we gave it to them for that reason. And so, Tor really likes to hold on to the audiobook rights if they can. And so we say, all right, add an extra amount of money onto the advance, and we'll give those to you, right? But it should all be, you should be arguing from the default of they get North American and nothing else. And anything else they want, they should add money to. And indeed, Tor offered $5,000 for my first book. Joshua came in and said, we're going to do 10 for North American only. And they're like, okay, but we'll give you 20 for World English. And we said no, because Joshua was pretty sure he could sell it in the UK for more, and he ended up doing that. So this is, what they're going to be doing are these sorts of things. And then there's all the little fiddly bits. Most of them don't exist in contracts. You want me to write fiddly bits up there? All right, fiddly bits. Once in a while, a publisher will put in some weird non-compete clause that no agent in the world will let them get away with, but they try to sneak them in anyway. This is kind of you can't write any other books for anyone else. What they do usually let the publisher put in is what we call a right of first refusal, which is the next, and then define what you want. In mine, it is the next epic fantasy in the Cosmere. Tor gets to see before anyone else, right? They don't get my YA, they don't get my non-Cosmere books, but I think that's what our right of first refusal to Tor is right now. They get to see it. They get to make an offer on it. Then we could shop it around if we wanted to, but we couldn't take less from anyone else. We have to give Tor the chance to match what someone else is offering, if that makes sense. That's right of first refusal. Usually it's very standard that they'll have right of first refusal on anything in a series that you're giving to them, at least the next book in the series. Right of first refusal on anything can be okay if you don't plan on writing in a lot of different genres. If you do, you may just want to squish that one back to a very specific term. My next book for X, which is similar to the book you just sold them. That one's an easy one for you to put in. You don't have to worry about that one too much. Once you've written the book and sent it to them, basically your obligation is taken care of. Okay? But they try to squeeze occasional little things in here that your agent will know to watch out for. That's the only big ones I would watch out for are non-compete clauses. And then, of course, they should not be trying to buy rights to the setting. You own the copyright to the books and the world. The only ones I've ever seen try to put this in are LDS publishers. When the big war between Covenant and Deseret Book was happening, Covenant kept losing their authors to Deseret Book because Deseret Book would offer them more money, so Covenant started sticking in these clauses. They're like, and then we own the rights to the world, so you can't leave and write in this world. You should not have that sort of language in any book you write unless it's what we call a work for hire, where, for instance, you've been hired to write, say, a book in the Wheel of Time, which in that case, you don't expect that you, the author, will take rights to the world and things like that. You will work for hire and give the book to them. Same thing for Star Wars. Same thing for some of these kind of planned, pre-packaged planned series. The famous ones are like Hardy Boys and things, but they did the 39 Clues or Spirit Animals or some of these things in YA lately where it's the publisher comes up with a big pitch and they say, we want 5 different authors to each write a book in this series. We're going to get a bunch of superstars. It's kind of like the Avengers for writing, middle-grade fantasy. And then, like Brandon Mull writes the first book and the last book, and then these people write in the middle. In those cases, those are considered work for hire. The contract, work for hire doesn't always mean terrible contract. It just means you don't own the world, okay? All right, last thing that an agent will do for you is career advice and book advice. This varies widely depending on the agent. A lot of agents like to be very involved editorially. You send them the book and they give you advice. They like to be there for you to sound ideas against. This is a great resource, a good reason to have an agent. Big thing you need to remember is that they work for you, all right? Now, they're not your employee, you are their client. But either way, you should remember that you are in charge of your career. Your agent is not a manager. Your agent handles these specific things. That is their job, and you are in a partnership with them because of that. However, don't let yourself get strung along by agents. The horror stories of agents, and this one happens way too often, is that an aspiring author sends an agent a manuscript. And even the good agents do this. It doesn't mean they're a bad agent, but even the good agents are like, I like these things about it. If you can do this revision, I think I'll be willing to look at it again. You do the revision, you send it back, and they're like, yeah, I think you need to change these few other things. You do that, you send it back, and this happens remembering that it takes them like 6 months to get back to you on each time. And so you can be with an agent for 3 years where they haven't actually picked you up, and they keep constantly asking for revisions. This is very natural on their part because they want to make sure you know how to do revisions, and they want to be presenting the best work that they can to their contacts in the publishing industry. But you can't let this go on forever. You can't put all your eggs in that agent's basket. You have to eventually say to them, I have done your revisions. I feel that the book is strong. Now is the point where I feel like we should either come to an agreement, or I should be working on something else. You should always be submitting to multiple agents during that time and not just counting on this one that has started to show some interest. You should not stop writing other things, and you shouldn't take their word as gospel. If they send back a bunch of feedback that you think makes the book worse, I would still suggest trying out a few of the things and seeing if you're right. As a new writer, that's very valuable. But if you try it out and you're like, I just do not like this, then that's probably going to be a bad agent match for you, even if they did accept you. All right? Famously, my agent has passed on a few books by friends of mine that he said to them, I think these are highly sellable books that I think you will have a great career with, but I'm the wrong agent for them because there are revisions I would request to make the book more enjoyable to me that I think actually would make the book kind of betray your vision for the book. And so a good agent should be doing that, or should be asking for the revisions, and if you call back or write back and say, I just don't think these make a good book, saying, all right, we probably show me a different project, maybe this is the wrong book for me, but don't revise endlessly and don't revise in a way you don't think it should be. This is a different relationship from your editor. Once you've entered into an agreement with your editor, you are contractually obliged to at least try out the things that they suggest and come to a compromise with an editor about what you're not going to change or how you're going to change it. You should both be pleased with the book when it goes to press. The agent doesn't have to necessarily be pleased with every aspect of the book. They work for you. With the editor, it's almost more like you work for them. You've been contracted by the publisher to license your book to them, present to them something they are pleased with publishing. All right? Yes?
How common is it to have multiple agents to represent multiple projects?
It is not very common, but also not unheard of. Generally, when you see this, they're stratified by genre, meaning you have one agent for your YA books and one agent for your adult books. That's the very most common that I see. There are occasional other splits. This agent handles thrillers. This agent handles my science fiction. This agent handles my nonfiction. This agent handles my fiction. That happens. Yeah.
So how many times would you recommend actually, assuming they're giving you revisions that you think are actually
good?
Potentially good?
I would say there is no hard, fast rule. I would say see how your relationship with them is going, see if it's making the book better, and make sure that you are not closing off other options. But I'm not going to give you a hard, fast rule. I'm just going to warn you that this happens, and your own comfort level with the agent will determine that, okay, whether you keep on going. Other horror stories. So ideally, they're supposed to sell your book, right? Well, There are times where authors have complained that they send in their book to the agent. The agent picks one editor they think it's good for, gives it to that editor, and kind of takes the first deal offered, because in the agent's head, this book is just not worth me taking to a dozen different people and trying to sell. You should always be pushing them to be sending it to a lot of different markets, even if they have one that they think is the prime candidate, because you want an auction, you want multiple eyes looking at it, and you want options. If an agent is only sending it one place, even if they think it's really well targeted, that's a bad sign. That doesn't mean good agents don't do that. They do sometimes. But again, you are in charge of your career. You need to know these things to give instructions to your agent. You should always see the rejection letters. Every time something's rejected, you should be able to have it sent to you, unless you're the type of person that destroys, whereupon have them sent to your spouse or roommate, so that at least someone is checking off the list that you are indeed getting rejections. The big danger with agents is to remember there is no quality control. There's no governing body. There's a few organizations that most of the good agents belong to, but not all of them. And most of the good agents live in New York, but not all of them. As my own agent famously once said, all it takes to be a literary agent is a business card that says literary agent on it. So, to get around that, what you should be doing is researching your agents before you send to them. You should be making sure that you can find books represented by this agent on the bookshelf at the local Barnes & Noble. If you can't, then the agent is likely not offering you anything more than you could do on your own. You should be making sure that they have made sales by newer authors in the last few years. If they haven't, they might be one of these big agents who's kind of resting on their laurels and not really doing much now other than collecting royalties from Stephen King's estate or whatever. I mean, Stephen, not his estate, but you know what I mean. He's still around. Stephen King left his agent, though. I'm not sure what's up with Stephen King. He has some weird agent stories. But you know what I'm saying. You should be making sure that you research them online and see what their authors are saying about them. Usually the forums, Predators and Editors is a good one to go to, or the Absolute Right Water Cooler. These are places where you can do a search and find almost every agent has a thread about them, where some people have popped in and said, yeah, I had a good experience, or, you know, I had this bad experience. Be warned. That, again, doesn't mean they're a bad agent, but it'll usually be one of these things on this list that I told you about that can go wrong. Okay?
What was the name of the first website you mentioned?
Predators and Editors. This is a website where they try to collect all the publishers and agents out there and then have people give them thumbs up or thumbs downs kind of things, and you'll read like what people have written about them. It's kind of like Rate My Teacher for agents, but was before that sort of website existed, so it's got a way worse interface. And then the Absolute Right Water Cooler is one of the premier forums for publishing with a high percentage of published authors and industry insiders posting on it. Yes?
How do you meet and otherwise first engage with an editor?
We'll go to that next. So, meeting editors on your own, we'll go to next. Yep.
Thoughts on taking chances on
New agents. So, I would highly recommend avoiding new agents unless they are at an established agency. Agents generally work under an apprenticeship program. Joshua, my agent, was at an agency called by an agent called Scott Meredith, as was Russell Galen and a couple of the other big agents in the business. Russ Galen had a bunch of clients, trained all these agents. Russ Galen then passed away, and they all started their own fragment agencies, which now all have sub-agents under them, like Eddie or Sam at Jabberwocky, which are kind of Joshua's agents that he is training. That isn't to say that a newer agent, there aren't outsiders that are still very good. Almost every one of them, in fact, everyone I've heard of that is a good agent who did not go through that was a former editor. Okay? The truth of this is, if they aren't doing what I'm going to talk about next, then they can do nothing for you. Okay? They just can't. And that's the harsh reality of this business. So, if you want to do it without this, but you still want to be published in New York, you need to be able to do number one on your own. Okay? This is what I did. I did this before there was self-publishing as a major force in the industry. So I would have a different path maybe now, but what you need to do is you need to make a list. You need to make a list of all the publishers that publish books like yours that you would like to be published with. And then you need to find the names of all the editors who work at these publishers. Okay? Find them on Google, find them by looking in authors' books and seeing who they acknowledge in their acknowledgments page, find out who works at the editor, at the publisher. Then you need to find the reputations of these specific editors. Predators and editors, very good place to do this. Absolute right water cooler. Talking to authors, emailing them, going to conventions and saying, hey, your editor is this person. What do you think of them? What's their editorial style? You are basically going to create a little black book, right, of publishers and of editors and agents. You want to do this for agents too. And then you generally want to find a way to target your books toward these people. Now, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I can't go into my big list of publishers. We can maybe do that next week. But let's say you are researching Tor. Tor has 20 editors, okay? About half of them part-time, half of them full-time. If you send to Tor your manuscript, you will generally, if you follow their guidelines, send it to Dear Acquisitions Editor. Any one of those 20 people could end up picking up that manuscript. Or, more likely, one of the interns will. Okay? They will look at your manuscript. This is important because a publisher like Tor has no set editorial direction for content. Meaning, Tom Doherty wants to publish the best of everything. It's one of the biggest publishers in the world for science fiction and fantasy. In the UK, Gallants and Orbit are both like this as well. Less of, a publisher and editorial direction. Over here, something like Baen Books has a specific style of book that is a Baen book, same as Daw. They have kind of an editorial style. In a book that doesn't match that publisher, none of the editors at the publisher are probably going to pick it up, but they usually only have 2 or 3 who share an editorial vision. So if you're sending to Tor and you're sending blindly, you may not know that a book that Patrick Nielsen Hayden would love is a book that, for instance, Liz Gorinsky might hate. Lots of varied opinions at the publisher. And so if you don't know who to address your book to, then your chances of getting published are much worse. You're basically doing what the agent does, right? This is what the agents do. This is why you're paying them 15%, is they live in New York, they know all these people, they go meet them all. You're going to have to do that without them. I'd recommend you do this exercise anyway, so when they do send them out, you can be like, oh yeah, I think Liz might be a good match for my book. And the agent be like, yeah, but Liz just bought one just like it. I think it might be better if we sent it, for instance, to Marco at Tor, who doesn't have an author like this, but I know has been looking for one, right? But you can actually, engage. The agent will love it if you can actually engage with them like that. But create your list, know what books they've edited, what their kind of editorial style is, and if you can possibly do it in science fiction fantasy, go to the science fiction cons and watch them on panels. Talk to them after the panels if they have some time. Be careful on this one. I've been teaching this class for 12 years and saying that, so sometimes the editors are used to being swarmed by my students. But it worked for some of them. Brian McClellan it worked for. But the idea is that if you're an editor, I don't want to give the impression that this is like an old boys club, mostly because the majority of them are women. But if you're an editor and you're sitting there looking at this stack of manuscripts, you pick up a cover letter and one says, Dear Acquisitions Editor, I hope you like my big epic fantasy. It's like this, end. Or instead you pick up a letter that says, Dear Liz Gorinsky, I love that you publish such and such author. She's one of my favorite writers. I watched you at Worldcon on this panel, and it really seemed like you understood narrative structure in the same way that I love narrative structure. I've enclosed my story that I think you'll like because it's like this, and does these certain things that I think are very individual and distinctive, and we might be a good match. Sincerely, author. Tell me which of those two you're going to read first. You're going to read the second one, obviously, okay? This is what you're looking to do. You do not want to fake that. You want to actually target at people your manuscripts the best way you can and target to agents in the same way. Do be aware that almost every agent will take any book in the genre they represent. They are not as editorially focused a lot of times as editors are. We are out of time. Save your questions for next week. I've got all the ones you wrote down on your little slips, and I'll go through those if we don't have enough questions next week, all right? Thank you guys very much.